Welcome to the new session of Software World with Jimdo. And here, this is the show. I invite people to talk about different topics in the software world and also in the tech industry. I'm Jimdo, your host today, and we will talk about the career path of software engineers. And my guest is Tobias Bales today, and I'm glad that you are here with us today, Toby. Welcome. How are you?
Hi, thank you. I'm quite well and really excited to be here. So that's cool. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, always. Could you introduce yourself a bit so for people can get to know you a bit more?
Sure. So I've been building software one way or another professionally for 12 years, I guess now. Started out in a small, in a medium-sized Hamburg agency. So it was mostly work for companies that hired them. What they did really well was there was mostly software engineers, a couple of people for controlling, a couple of people for office management, but it was very engineering focused. They did pretty well. It was tough because there was a lot of work time expected, I would say. So like it was normal to work, I don't know, an hour to two more each day, which adds up quickly. At the same time, it was really good at learning those shipping the 80% and 20% of the time. So focusing on the important bits. And like after like university, I think I can highly recommend that if you're willing to do the crunch thing. It was mostly a Java shop back then. So that's what I started in. I then switched into their in-house product development and Clojure with a J, like the Lisp that runs on the JVM, which was interesting. And also dabbled a bit on the side with Haskell. And that's will be a recurring pattern that I tend to work in a lot of stacks, I guess. So like 3.5 years later, I joined another company called 42. It's really small, like 10-ish people, Hamburg-based. They mainly have two products like invoicing and also people dispatch management, but they live or used to live at least from project work as well. I was mostly doing the product work with them initially in Haskell actually, and then we rewrote one of the applications in Ruby on Rails because the other product was in Rails, which is still my go-to stack, to be honest, because it's just so super efficient. Stayed there for another 3.5 years. And then I joined Jimdo. So I've always done full stack work. So meaning from CSS to whatever. I'm not really strong in CSS. Like I can do basic box model and that, but it takes me forever if it needs to be pixel perfect. So then I joined Jimdo as a front-end engineer because I was curious about React, to be honest. And I had taught that myself over like a couple of weeks, really. And I also knew so I got the invite basically via an school friend of mine who used to work at Jimdo. So that's how it was actually came on my radar, I suppose. So I was an engineer, mostly full stack again, because we were lacking backend-ish people. So yeah. Did that for a year and a half, I guess. Year and a half, somewhere around that. When my former team lead, what it was called then, was moving teams, was like, hey, so you were interested, right? And I was actually at home, sick, sitting on the sofa, and he was like, sorry, can I call you real quick? I was like, sure. So you were interested in doing that, right? Yeah. Yeah, well, I need to move to a different team, so it's yours. Good luck. And it was a bit like that in terms of like being dropped into a ocean of cold water, I suppose, because back then, at least at Jimdo, it was very unstructured to a certain extent.
Yeah. So
the people that had people management responsibility were either product or engineering background, so it was mishmash of everything. I did that for 2.5, 3 years. So actually,
how many people were in the team actually?
When I started out, it was 4 engineers, including myself. So it turned into 3 engineers and me. We merged the teams. At peak times, I think the team was 11 engineers plus a designer. So also like from small to large to a bit smaller again. Yeah, I did that for 2.5, 3 years and turned back to an individual contributor role like half a year ago now. Initially joined our platform team, which builds the internal platform as a service that we deploy our services on, and recently moved to a different team that is between a feature and a platform team, but it's turning into a platform team, really. Yeah, and that's where I am. And so over And what I meant earlier, like with this, a lot of stacks. So I professionally worked in Java, Kotlin, JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Ruby, Haskell, PHP, Clojure. And I think there are like one or two more things in various stacks, which makes me very much I get very comfortable in a stack very quickly, but most of the stacks except for Rails, I don't know in depth really. But it's good enough for most cases.
It feels like you are the perfect fit for this, the job ads online, asking for everything. So it looks like you are the perfect fit for one of them, at least.
But I don't have like 12 years of experience with everything. So that's the downfall.
I mean, they generally ask like 3 years experience. So you should be good in this case.
Nice.
Yeah. So it's like, I can see that your career is, I don't know, it's not in one line, let's say. So it's the quite opposite. So jumping from stack to stack, also from being an engineer role, and then jumping into management and then coming back. But now I'm thinking, like, how does the career path look like in general in the industry? So for like, it's a bit different for everyone, but can we define a bit what is the general career expectancy and also the software industry, how we do that?
Sure. So from my experience, based on Jimdo and what I've talked to about and other like people in other companies, I think most people start off as a software engineer, and you normally have this junior or associate engineer, senior engineer. Often that's it. Then once companies get a bit bigger, they tend to add some management tracks. So you have like your IC track here, and then management branch offs, which seems like it's the only way forward in terms of having higher impact, which was my motivator. And at Jimdo at the same time, like at that point in time, it was the only thing to have more impact because there was nothing else basically. And I think that is common for companies that are like smaller than 500 to 1,000 people. I feel like that's where the line most of the time is, where you actually have a leadership ITC track or whatever you want to call it. So what's often referred to as staff engineer plus. And so from my perspective nowadays, if you include larger companies, it's more like you have the individual contributor track and you can branch off of that into management. What most people do not realize, and I am completely guilty of that as well, is like, so I'm going to become a manager. Cool. And then you're like, okay, I used to be a senior engineer. Now I'm a junior manager. That is actually like, you start, like there's some overlap in skills, and it helps you that you understand what people are talking about, but it's so vastly different, and was interesting.
Yeah, this part is like, I think the general problem in the industry, that people think that like if you are an engineer and if you become a software engineer, like senior software engineer, and then everyone thinks that they should go to management. Not everyone. I think it starts to change a bit, and especially in the bigger companies. In startups, basically everyone is doing everything. So I don't include startups in this position.
Sure.
But besides that, I think the industry is evolving to identify the IC track a bit better in general. And people also started to change the mind, as far as I see, in general. And for me, the main difference or the career path should be back and forth between management, and this would be my ideal. And also I have researched a bit more on this topic, and what I have seen that people also recommend going to management and coming back time to time, because you understand the two lines perfectly. Of course, you don't become an expert in this case in one line, I assume. So what do you think about like how people can climb these ladders? So does it have to be always in IC track? When you make the switch to management, can you go to there, and can you like switch back and forth? What do you think?
So obviously you can at least go once back. No, I think it depends a lot of context, right? So what the company's status and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot of value for engineers doing some management, because it gives you a lot of context and you start thinking differently about certain things at least. And I think it depends and also it depends on organization size, right? So if you have an organization size that is, I don't know, like 2 200-300 people or something, maybe 400, I'm not sure, or where you have at least like you have your engineer, then the manager of that engineer, and then you probably have a head of engineering, VP engineering, CTO, whatever. Then I think going back and forth between management and IC makes sense. But if you have like longer hierarchies, so I don't know, engineer, manager, head of engineering, VP engineering, CTO, it is a lot harder because the problem is you're kind of like, no, it's not necessarily harder. And I think it still makes you a better engineer, at least, probably also a better manager to a certain extent, like just from time spent. But the problem is like if you are motivated by career goals kind of things, which is not for me, but some people are, like if you keep flip-flopping between of them, you'll never go higher in the management hierarchy, and the further you're removed from software engineering, the less valuable your engineering skills become, obviously. So like if you're a manager of managers, so like VP level or something, yes, it's good if you have a baseline technical understanding, but that's roughly about what's required of that, right? So I think it depends. So I think the flatter the hierarchy, the more reasonable it is, or if you're just fine with going back and forth between engineering and management.
Yeah, it has a high effect on the expertise in both lines. So you won't be an expert in both engineering, and I don't think it might help you to become a better manager, but I also don't think that you can go up to the CTO level in higher lines in hierarchy, because that you are switching back to engineering, and then so those are totally separated lines. And since you're talking about the seniority, I get a lot of questions, and also this is like a controversial topic and a debate in the industry. Seniority, the topic, and you can say your own opinion, and everyone has their own opinion about it. There are some frameworks that we define what seniority is, but this is not accepted for like everyone. And so for you, what is seniority actually? What do you mean when a person says they are senior?
That's a very interesting question. And you also mentioned frameworks. So there is, for example, the framework by CircleCI, which I think you know, which helped me give a grasp on it. I can give a short intro in a second. But in general, so I think with higher seniority come one, more autonomous work, and also to a certain extent, the ability to help others improve at what they're doing, so mentoring. At the same time, you can also have a junior engineer mentor a senior engineer if the junior engineer has been with the company for some time, so it doesn't always need to be technical. What a lot of people neglect, I think, like a lot of people focus very strongly on the technical side, right? Yeah. And forget stuff like leadership, communication, which is specifically in remote work, like really, 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 really important, because if you like cannot get two coherent sentences out in written form, that's going to be bad time. So I think it's, and that's why those frameworks really help me to think about it more, because you probably like specifically the more senior, you get whatever that means, like they're more rounded to a certain extent, I should think you should be. So like if you're abysmal at writing anything down, you might be the best like software engineer ever, it will still hamper you to a certain extent if you cannot communicate with non-tech people, for example. So I think you have to, well, most people probably, it helps to at least try to be somewhat rounded in your skill sets and not just focus just on the technical stuff. There are definitely jobs where that's also a huge, totally fine and makes sense. Also, it's not from everybody, obviously. But I think it's mostly around, yeah, it goes from, so going back to those frameworks, right? The one that I kind of like is from, as I mentioned, like over and over again, because I'm an idiot, CircleCI. So they basically define associate engineer, senior engineer, staff engineer, senior staff engineer, and principal engineer. And they have a lot of different skills from technical, communication, leadership, strategic thinking, business acumen, all those things. And basically each skill, like each skill level really has a different scope. So for the associate engineer, it's within the task. So the expectation of a junior engineer would be like, you can be like, yeah, this is your task. If you need help, please ask for it. But you're kind of expected to be able to carry that out, right? For the engineer without anything, it would be within the epic. So like you have a bigger story and it's like, here, please just make sure that this epic work, right? Yeah. Senior engineers, I think, I think that matches my expectations of senior engineers. And I think it's not related to years of spending years at a company or years of work experience in general, because that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot, right? Because I've been doing the same shit badly for the last 20 years. I'm probably still not a good engineer. So for the senior engineers, like it's defined as within the team, staff engineer within the team, and business stakeholders, which makes sense because that makes it a bit trickier, right? Because you have more non-technical people and you have to navigate those parts a bit more.
Okay, I would argue a bit that not only business stakeholders, but also the other technical stakeholders. So I don't know, does it count in business, but like, okay. Well,
yeah, sure, but a bit like, so basically team plus stakeholders. That makes a whole lot of sense, really. Yeah. Then you have the senior staff engineer, which is basically across multiple teams. So if you have adjacent teams that, for example, if you're focusing on security, that you make sure that that complex kind of makes sense. And then you have principal engineer, which is basically across the organization, and that mental model really helps me, like on a baseline mental model, really. But yeah.
Yeah, like there are some gaps in all those frameworks, and there will be. My general understanding about seniority is that like key points, at least for me, that the things that you said in the beginning, like being autonomous, is like, I think, one of the important aspects. And also now we are not facing that one a lot, but carrying out the existing job. So when you join a new company, are you able to grasp what has been done before you quickly, and then continue further developing it and estimate what needs to be done and etc. properly? I think this is a bit more related to seniority, because if you're, let's say, junior or associate, or maybe in a mid-level engineer, you basically are not really comfortable with like writing or working in a code base that someone else wrote. You need to understand better. And one thing I saw on the internet, and I want to ask, like, this is a bit weird question, but I really like the question. In general, do the senior engineers or the experienced people, let's say, are smarter than the junior people?
No. Like, you know more, yes, you might be able to. So I think it's mostly around having mental context, right? So
yeah.
So for example, what makes it easy for me to pick up a new stack is because I can be like, okay, so there's this thing that looks roughly similar to that in stack X, so it's probably the same. And I'm going to tend to make those connections quickly. But that doesn't have inherently anything to do with being smart or intelligent or anything. It's more really about the context and having something to compare it against, right? So if you're a junior engineer, everything is new. And you don't have anything to compare it against. And you don't know if this is good, is this good? I don't know. But as you do more things, people tell you like, hey, this might not be great because of X, Y, and Z. And then you put that into your mental box of this is good, this is bad. And then you start connecting those things over time. And it has inherently nothing to do with being smart. It's learning, it's skill acquisition, as with everything else, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah. So like the one thing you said, you learn something and you put into your, let's say, mental box, and you assume that it is good, because some senior or experienced engineer told you, or maybe you read it in somewhere. I want to just point that out, that whatever you hear, I would say if you're a junior, it's understandable that you think the things that you have read or someone recommended you is better, is okay. But when you gain more experience, you start questioning those things, because then you start analyzing, is it really good or not? But if you're a junior, it's really hard. So one important aspect of being an engineer, but more on the junior side, is asking questions, actually. because I talk with many people, like many junior developers, and when I talk with them, they are generally neglecting to ask questions. Like I always say, yeah, do you have any question? Do you have any more question? One more, please ask one more. And most of the time they just step back, and then they think that they are not smart, let's say, or they have the feeling. That's why I liked this being smart question, because it's not. And normally I will say there is no stupid question all the time. I don't know how many times I repeated that statement. I don't know. But what I also realize is that when you become more senior, you start asking more questions as well. That's one thing I realized later on when I gained more experience, because when you become more senior, you start explaining things to people. To be able to explain things to people, you start asking more questions. Maybe not everyone, but to yourself. So that was a different experience for me, at least.
That makes a whole lot of sense. And I think also with more experience, hopefully more and more people get to the point that you also make sure that people ask questions if they are stuck, right? Or before they get stuck, ideally. And I think this plays into this whole psychological safety. And there is I think from Google, isn't it called Work at Google? I'm not certain. But there's a playbook basically by Google around what makes good teams. And part of that is psychological safety. Because if you don't feel like you can make mistakes, chances of you growing fast are very, very, very small. And I think making mistakes and asking questions are two very, very important bits. And if you don't feel safe in an environment, then that's going to be very hard.
Yeah. I mean, creating the safe environment for junior people is also a good, important topic. Creating this environment is really hard, I would say.
It's definitely hard. It's also not just for junior people, right? Because otherwise you end up with people being like, oh, but I'm a senior engineer. I'm not allowed to ask questions anymore. Yeah, congratulations on that one. So you really want to be open for everybody, I think, to ask questions. And I really like this. There are no dumb questions, because like if people tend to ask a question, there's probably a reason for it, because they need some kind of information or context, and better provide that, because why wouldn't you?
Yeah, and it helps for senior people, actually. So when senior people, when junior person ask a question to senior, let's say, I mean, when I say senior, I'm putting it in the quotes here, yes. Air quotes, because I don't like the term, but it's another story. When a junior asks a question, it is better for everyone. So that's also often forgotten. And that's also one of the reasons why I say all the time, there is no stupid question. Yeah, so we talked about this, like the seniority and also the management. And the one thing that I want to point is the switch, actually. So let's say you are a senior now, and then there's a point that came that there's no point forward for you, like the obvious one, that how can you grow as a title. So there you might be in a smaller company, or maybe there's literally the company might be big enough, but there is no title beyond seniority, and only thing that seems is management most of the time. And so like my general question is, how do you make this decision of being like switching to management in this case, or saying, okay, I'm senior, but there's nothing else, so what should I do? Like maybe switch company just because I'm not growing, in air quotes, or like making this decision is really hard. And how do you make this decision actually?
Mm-hmm. I think I think what makes a really important difference is the motivation. So if it's about having more impact, you can most of the time, even if your title doesn't go on, you can probably find a way, unless the organization is set up in a way that it's really, really hard to break through that. So that, I don't know, engineers are not allowed in meetings X, Y, and Z, but that's where the really important bits happen. So then you kind of have to find a way around that, right? If it's just about titles, then yes, probably if there's just management to quote unquote grow, then that is probably the way, right?
Yeah.
What I think, and I had a lot of conversations after I switched back to an IC role with people in the company were like, so I'm thinking about becoming an EM. Do you think it's a good idea? And I'm like, how would I know? So, but what's important to differentiate from my experience is on one hand, you have leadership, right? And on the other hand, you have management. So management is the people management. Doing one-on-ones, well, that can also be part of leadership, but making sure that everything works out well, that the team is going roughly in the right direction, making sure that you do annual reviews, quarterly reviews, whatever you do, and all that part. And the leadership part is the more emotional part. And I would argue that at least from senior onwards, you need quite a bit of leadership skills as well, like as an IC, but also as a manager. And it basically comes down to, from my experience, I guess, and also basically how I made that decision is like, do I enjoy the management bit? And like when I made that switch, I did not think about it like this at all because I had no clue what I was getting into. But it's where I arrived at some point, right? And I was like, so I'm really like, the leadership stuff is fine, and I enjoy doing a lot of the things that I do. But I'm not a terrible manager, but it's also not where my heart is really. And I feel like I can provide more value to the company also as an IC. And yeah, that's basically where I was like, so I went to my boss back then, like, so Nadia, huge shout out because she has helped me tremendously through all those years. And like, I wouldn't be where I am right now without her, to be honest. I was like, so I've been thinking, she was like, oh God, what's coming? I would like to go back to engineering. She was like, okay, that's not so bad. Good. And we talked about it, and there was also questions came up like, how urgent is this? Like, do you need to basically abandon your team right now because you'll quit otherwise? Like, no. Like, it's fine, but at some point I would like to. And I was the EM of one of our teams back then, and we had just hired. No, shortly afterwards, we came to the agreement that we wanted to hire back somebody who used to work freelance for us, but as an engineering manager, who then took over the team, which was very nice. Sadly, the team that I was in had way too much ownership at that point in time. So that was, I think, 3 months after I decided to want to go back to engineering, right? So the new engineering manager for my team arrived then. But we needed to split some of the responsibility out of that team. So I ended up basically founding a new team with a couple of people from that team and becoming the engineering manager for a new team, even though I wanted to get out of management, right? Which was a bit hard. At the same time, it made a lot of sense for the company. And it's like, it was not only driven by, is this where my heart is? Because it is not. But also by where can I actually have positive impact on the company? And so I was like, we need this right now, so I'll do that. And I did that for another 3 months, I guess, roughly, until we find somebody else to replace me there, also a new hire. And then I went on to the platform team, which was very, very nice. So yeah, it was an interesting experience, but it was hard to talk about it to a certain extent because it was like, there's some fears associated with it, right? It was like, what if the answer is no? Like, will I be like, okay, then screw this, I'm going to leave? I don't know. Like, it wasn't that bad, right? Yeah. But it was very nice. She was super supportive, and it was very, very good. And what's interesting, afterwards, people were like, that is so impressive. And I'm like, what is so impressive? That you went back to being an engineer. I'm like, why is that impressive? Because most people would consider that a step down, right? I'm like, yeah, I guess so. I hadn't even realized that until that point. So that was interesting, but yeah.
Is it a step down?
No.
No? Yeah, no. I mean, you said both sides include leadership. So I assume that you keep or you want to have more leadership in the IC track instead of having the people management track. But what leadership, what is the difference between two leaderships? So I understand that in management track, you have one-on-ones and etc. Like you do maybe performance review. But what is leadership in the IC track in this case? What do you do?
Sure. So I actually also have a couple of one-on-ones with a couple of people across the organization, just because I'm a bit of a nosy person and like to know what's going on, but it's also helpful to talk to other people to figure out what they are doing, to see what they're struggling with, because I've been with the company for some time. I know a lot of our systems, and sometimes I can be of help, but also it's often very, very valuable to me, and also to see if there are things going on. And besides that, I don't know. So we started trying to rework our API standards recently, right? I would also classify that as trying to push for that. If you realize something is wrong, trying to help teams understand what they can do to do that better.
Mm-hmm.
That's one part. So, and right now, I'm in a team, as I mentioned, it owns our web delivery for the Dolphin product, which currently is kind of a feature team, but at the same time, I think it's going to turn into a platform team relatively soon, because we will have multiple teams that need to integrate with us, and we build the baseline thing that serves websites and does TLS termination and all those things. And part of that leadership is also making sure that we have an aligned understanding of where we want to go, why we want to go there, how we're going to go there, and also, so we're actually, I don't know if I should talk about this. I think it's fine. So we're currently started to working on a technical strategy, right? So we want to do some pretty major changes, because we need to change a lot of things in order to be able to integrate nicely. Because right now we have a couple of things that integrate with web delivery, and they're like this, which is a whole lot of fun, because you change one thing and everything else breaks, kind of. And we really want to redo that, but we decided to not be like, okay, we're going to pull this out and rewrite it, and it's going to be awesome, but actually take a small step back and be like, so what were our issues? How do we think we can address them? What does that mean for other teams? And so that we come up with a strategy of like, we want to go there roughly this way. This is why we think it's good. That's what the business value that comes out of it, because some business value needs to be created to a certain extent, right? But yeah.
Yeah. I now have a bit better understanding regarding tech leadership or IC leadership, but I'm struggling how to involve or not involve, but more like work with engineers in this case. So when you become a tech leadership, like when you go into tech leadership in IC track, you start working in organizational level, like maybe tech strategy, maybe different things that will have an impact on the whole organization, or maybe a couple of teams only, doesn't matter. But basically you are not doing the exact work, or are you doing the exact work, like the literal hands-on coding?
I do, but so I code more than I did when I was a manager, and I coded too much when I was a manager sometimes, to be fair. So so I do code more. I don't code nearly as much as I did before I turned into management, absolutely. Yeah. And so it depends. I often also pair with people, and I tend to do the navigator more then, for various reasons. But so no, it's not about solving everything yourself, because so if you want to have more impact, you kind of need to find a way there's this scaling yourself thing, right?
Yeah.
But I probably can have a lot more positive impact if I help people to learn how to come up with better solutions, or to evaluate trade-offs with things, instead of doing that myself. Because if I do that always myself, I'm always going to be a bottleneck, and that's not what you're aiming for, right? And which is hard. Like, mind you, it's really, really hard, because I enjoy coding. And it's like, oh, I could do this. This will be awesome. I'm going to have a great afternoon. And it's like, but maybe it's actually a terrible idea. So maybe not. But yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, yes, you are less coding. But is it like when you go up to principal, let's say principal engineer and etc., you start coding less and less. But in principal engineering, does it like you don't code at all?
It depends, right? As with always. Are you aware there's a website called staffeng.com?
Yeah, I know.
And they have this.
They published a book recently, I guess.
That could be. I'm not sure. And they have this staff engineering archetypes, right? Which I think is also very helpful, because what people always assume, and again, this is borrowing from larger organizations, right? So like if you're in a company that is less than 100 people, this probably doesn't make any sense.
Exactly.
But so they have 4 archetypes basically. So like the tech lead, which tends to be mostly in a team that just makes sure that you have a coherent technical vision and around those things. So basically a sparring partner for the manager, probably, at least in the setup that we run at the moment. Then you have the architect, which is like enterprise architect, but maybe less bad, but you know what I mean, I think. There's the solver, which is quite interesting because when I read that, I was like, oh yeah, that's one of my bosses like 2 jobs ago. He was totally that, who basically, like when the person just digs into some of the harder technical problems and just keeps digging, probably very, very, very hands-on, even at the principal level, and just tries to keep to remove like the biggest hurdles, roadblocks, whatever you have on a technical level. And they have the right hand, and which is basically the right hand of the CTO or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Where you probably don't code a whole lot, if at all. So the solver will probably code a whole lot. Architect differs. I would hope that they code at least a good chunk of their time, because if you do this, oh no, but you're going to build it like this thing, not the biggest
fan. I will come up to architect later on.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I think it depends also on the context that you're in, what your particular skill sets and interests are, and also what the company can support to a certain extent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now I want to go like quickly to architect position. Where do we place architect in this career lines, let's say? Because many people, they say, I really like working with architecture. I want to become a software architect. Or there are a lot of people who have no idea what actually software architect is, because it is the job of every software engineer at the end, every person in the IC track also, it's their job. So why do we need a separate software architect separated from everyone and just working on the architecture?
Yeah, I think that position is something that we absolutely don't need, right? Because if you just build architectures and somebody else has to execute it, it's bound to be really, really ugly. But what I think, and I agree with you, like every software engineer that is interested in architecture, I hope you have a baseline interest in architecture because it helps you just build better systems.
Yeah.
But where this normally falls short is the team boundaries, or maybe like the team boundaries 2 teams over or something. So sometimes you have individual teams that are very cliquey, and sometimes you have like 2-3 teams that are somewhat coherent, but those teams over there do something completely different, and those teams do something else, and they sometimes don't talk a whole lot. And that's what I don't know, like what I could imagine this to look like for it to work, that if you have like a couple of people, not one person, like 2-3 people that have a lot of architectural experience that work together, like that communicate a lot to align on things, and then work with teams or groups of teams to make sure that everything is moving roughly in a similar direction, right? Doesn't need to be the same thing, and sometimes you have a very peculiar case where it needs to be completely different. Absolutely fine. But that it's in a controlled environment and not everybody doing their own thing, basically. And I think that's where the value comes from. Also for, like, not everybody has built every system ever, right? Which would be confusing if everybody did that, because how would you? So being able to talk to people that think about architecture a lot and being like, so we have this problem. I think this might be an option. What do you think? And I'm like, those are the trade-offs. That's what you're looking for. No, maybe not. You have other options. And then you can, so it's not about dictating that, but helping teams find good architectures that work for them, right? Because there's also not this one architecture that does everything, because there are always trade-offs. And it's just about understanding those trade-offs, I think. And that's where this might be helpful from my experience.
Yeah, it's like, there was one analogy in, which book I remember? I think it was in Building Microservices from Sam Newman, saying that the software architect is actually a wrong term. It should be software kind of planner, because they compare, like they did do the analogy of city planning. So in city planning, basically what you do is you just draw some zones, and in the zone you say, okay, this is the industrial area in the industrial zone that only the industrial buildings will be there. So you create the infrastructure of the city accordingly. And then in some areas, you say, okay, this is the residential area, these are the commercial area, and etc. And this is what the software architect does actually. So you don't, in city planning, you don't go and say that, oh, sorry, you cannot build or you cannot paint your apartment's wall like blue or something. So in software coding, these are like engineers are building the buildings actually, let's say, but software architects are just saying, okay, these areas is residential, so you need to build residential buildings. Maybe there are some limitations of like how many floors and etc. you can go up. So these kind of analogy, I think it makes more sense. And I like the term software planner a bit better than software architect actually. But yeah, it's often used in the wrong way.
I agree. It's also executed pretty poorly, I think, very often, because it's a nice way to promote somebody to like the place of absolute power, which sounds great on paper, at least for that person, but probably ends up pretty horrible most of the time, for the rest at least.
Yeah, the titles. Yeah. Okay, I have one more question. Do you think the titles are so important? So we are talking about titles a lot, but do you really think that they are important that much?
Depends on your personal motivation, right? So some people get a really big kick out of that. I personally, not really. Although my manager might be like, maybe you are, but I really don't. It's more about, sometimes it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? So if you don't have those titles yet, people might be like, but an engineer doesn't belong there. And you're like, so what? Yeah. Like, either I can go there now, or you give me the title so I can go there. But at least for me, it's more of a vessel and an enablement to be like, no, but I want to spend, I don't know, 20% of my time, no, it's less, but like a certain amount of my time, at least an hour or two each week, to talking to people in other teams on a regular basis, just so there's some more cross-company communication, for example.
Yeah, I also don't care a lot about titles personally, but what I do care about is profession, to be honest. Like when people say that they want to grow themselves in their area, let's say be a software engineer, and focusing on in the profession of the software engineering is, for me at least, is more important than focusing on being a senior or being a principal engineer. And if you want to go in the management line, then focusing on the management profession is more important. Then also, this is also what I recommend to more junior people who want to become a senior, because when you focus on being a senior, generally you don't become a senior that easy, I would say.
Or you try to start gaming the system, which I think also happens. So like if there's like, if you want to be a senior engineer, you need to do X, Y, and Z. So you just start doing X, Y, and Z and not the rest, which is also not great. So yeah.
Yeah, true. Yeah, true. Exactly. Yeah, also titles are different for each company. That's one other thing, because you can be a senior in one company, but when you switch the job, you might be mid-level engineer. You never know.
Sure.
Because like the expectations are very different. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was about to say expectations are very different. And also some companies like literally measure in years of experience or something like that, right? Which...
Yeah, this is bad.
Yeah, it is bad because it doesn't mean a whole lot, but sometimes it can be frustrating if you have like people where like, I would really like to work with them. But they're like, no, I'm a super senior staff principal person. So I need $1 million a year. Sorry about that. And you're like, but yes, you have worked a lot, but like,
yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Like I just checked a couple of people's resumes, like on LinkedIn, and what I found is that having like switching from principal or let's say staff engineer to senior, and maybe in other company going to senior staff engineer is also quite often. This question is interesting. So what could be the possible career paths for software engineers who are over 40 or 50 years old?
Yes, that is very good. Like, that's a very good question. And it was also like after I decided to go back to, so there's this conception at least of like the software industry tends to discriminate against older people at a certain point in time. And after I switched back to engineering, I was like, is this really a good idea? I'm not. It'll be fine. So, but I think for startups that might partially be true, because like when your body gets older, like working really dumb hours, which I think is not a good idea anyways, but at some point your body's just going to be like, fuck that, I'm not going to do that, sorry. And it's not great as a 20 something anyways, but I think the older you get, it doesn't make any sense at the same time. And I think actually that more senior roles are very, very well suited to this, because so if we look at JavaScript, everything is really, really high churn, right? But you maybe don't have to follow all that, for example, to still be able to help people navigate all that and to help them to write better code in general, even though you might not know framework XYZ that just came around the corner that we have to use now. I think also other ecosystems are more stable in that regard, but I think it makes no sense for most organizations to like decide based on age, because it doesn't, because the experience, unless you're like, okay, I know everything and I'm not going to learn, that is going to be a problem. But that's also going to be a problem when you're 20, right? So I don't think, as long as there's no cockiness involved, I think there's not a problem really. And yes, I know some organizations are a lot better or worse than others. So, but I think there's nothing stopping you from just keeping like doing what you like doing. And if that's writing code all day, that makes a whole lot of sense. If you want to work more, like pair more or try to mentor people more, that also makes a whole lot of sense, right? And also, when you get older, you get more perspective on a lot of things, I think.
Yeah.
Also, you've seen more things, right? So, I mean, now we have microservices. Before that, we had monoliths. Before that, we had SOA. Great. What's going to come next? Probably monoliths again. But we'll see, you know? But like you also see those cycles, and I think you can be a bit more relaxed about it. And also, like, there's also this notion of like the 10x engineer or the 100x engineer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that one. But I think where engineers can really excel, and I think that's where experience actually helps, is trying to make clever business trade-offs. So being like, hey, so we want to build this feature, right? Yeah, sure. But if we drop this tiny bit of it, that doesn't matter. It's like 10% implementation effort. And I think that's why you get this, like this real multiplication effect, because if you really start cutting out some really much complexity out of it, you can build very similar solutions with a lot less work. And I think the older you get, the more likely you are to see those things as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Like the age is there's a I don't know, a bit, I don't say a bit discrimination, but it is. We have in the industry that there's also perception that the software engineers are always young. But it's not true actually. We have the average age, I would say, but there's just relation between the age, saying that okay, in startups especially, young people are preferred because they do overtime, and if you are 40, then maybe you have kids, maybe you don't, but you have other responsibilities that you want to take care, and you don't want to work 16 hours a day. Or maybe you are still 20, you don't want to work 16 hours a day, it still applies, and it doesn't matter. So you need the energy to be involved in these, like maybe a startup or maybe overtime work. But I personally really don't want to work overtime. Doesn't matter if I'm 18. I didn't want it when I graduated from university. So that's the case. Okay, we are slowly coming to an end. And if people have some questions, please just write in the chat. And if you are watching or listening to this, just send me an email. The link is in the description. You will find it. And before closing, I want to ask Toby, so we talked about many things. What would be your like top 3 or 4, let's say, recommendation for the career in career growth for people who are watching or listening us?
stay curious and ask questions. Definitely, always. Be kind. Like, it is a lot easier to teach people new technical skills than to, if they are a dick, then you're probably not going to change it, or you need to put a lot of work in it. Like, be a decent human being. That really goes a long way from my experience. Enjoy life as well. So like, don't just spend your time doing that. If you have the energy and the interest, doing side projects can be a huge boost to your knowledge because you can try out things in a more sandboxed environment. Yeah, I think that would be those things not maybe sorted. Yeah, stay curious and ask questions is definitely the first one.
Sorted, interesting. Yeah,
like by priority or whatever you want to call
it. Yeah, I would say like being kind is often forgotten. It didn't came to my mind even while we are talking in 1 hour during the hour. And I just remembered that I had a really weird and not kind senior engineer before while I was a bit junior, and it was horrible. It was horrible. Yeah, thanks for this recommendation, and I think it goes a long way. It works a lot actually for many people.
Yes, and don't forget, like, the other people are also people, right? They are software engineers. They are still people. They make mistakes. They write code that is not the best. Happens.
I mean, yeah, of course. If you're a senior engineer or like, I don't know, principal, you also write bad code depending on the
exactly.
situation.
I write a lot of shit code.
Yeah. Who doesn't? Yeah. Okay. So we are closing, and last thing I want to ask is, do you have a shout out? So like, it can be a person or book or I don't know, event, doesn't matter. The one thing that you really liked recently that you want to appreciate in front of others.
Can it be two?
Of course.
Cool. So number one is, again, Nadia Macht, who used to be my manager at Jimdo, because she helped me grow tremendously as an engineer and also as a person. Like, I would not be where I am right now, and I'm really, really thankful. And the other is a book recommendation, I guess. So if you're not purely focused on the front end, building data-intensive application, it's a bit of a bumpy start because it's a bit of a bumpy start, but it's a really, really good book that talks about a lot of trade-offs between different ways of storing and managing data, and like things that you assume about databases if you don't think about it that are probably not true, and helps you understand those a lot more, and that's makes you build better systems.
Great. Yeah. My shout out this week will be a book Nadia actually recommended me to read. That one is Nonviolent Communication from Rosenberg. That is an amazing book, and I read it before, and this week I checked my book notes again, and it's an amazing book, and this is my shout out for this week. Yes. Okay. Toby, do you have anything else to add?
No, thank you very much for having me, and also thank you for the question. I really liked that one.
Thanks a lot for being here, joining us. I really enjoyed this talk. And for people who are watching or listening us, thanks for being with us today. And next week, we will have, of course, another session, but this time a bit more technical. Most probably, we will talk about on-call next week. So stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe to via Super Peer and also via to Newsletter. So you will get the new sessions in your inbox directly. And yeah, thanks a lot. See you later, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.